I'm really honored to begin this wonderful series on systemic change and offer what I hope will be sort of the origin story of how we got here. Let me just quickly share my screen with everyone and make sure everything's okay. So today what I wanted to do was offer an origin story, really. We need to understand, if we want to design new systems, if we want to create systemic change, that things don't happen haphazardly, they happen by design. And for me, one of the things that I often begin with as a scholar of Middle East literature and cultural studies is I always go back to Orientalism. And I'm going to explain to you what Orientalism is, because it's really the ideology or the political philosophy that mandated or justified colonialism, which is the main thing that gave us the capitalist system and its afterlives that we have today. So we're going to do a few things throughout the next few minutes. We're going to ask a few questions and answer them. Some of them are, how was Orientalism used as an ideological tool on the part of colonial powers to gain and maintain control of indigenous land and resources? And then throughout that, obviously, control the flow of capital to certain areas of the world and not others. In what ways did Orientalism provide a lifeline of great power to the colonial metropoles? And how does indigenous knowledge help us debunk the myths of Orientalism? I think it helps by we have to start out by defining what Orientalism is. And these are two official definitions that were taken. The first is from Encyclopedia Britannica, which will kind of tell you why this was defined this way. But for the longest time throughout centuries, up until about 1979, according to European powers, Orientalism was defined as a Western scholarly discipline of the 18th and 19th centuries, where people studied the languages, literatures, philosophies, laws, and civilizations of mostly Asian societies, but not exclusively, especially ancient ones. And this includes ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and those types of empires of antiquity, moving forward into the Mediterranean basin and expanding as far east and as far west, and as far north and as far south as we can. The second, and perhaps probably the most informative about what Orientalism has come to mean in today's society, is the representation of Asia, mostly but not exclusively, hence the word Oriental, especially the Middle East and North Africa, in a very stereotyped way that has cliches and stereotypes that embody a colonialist attitude. And we owe the second definition, which was taken from the Oxford English Dictionary, to the work of the late Palestinian-American critic and philosopher and professor of comparative literature, Edward Said, who in 1979 published this groundbreaking book called Orientalism, where he looks at centuries-long practices of Orientalist attitudes and processes of othering people, which is basically a way of saying marginalizing them, dehumanizing them, disinheriting them throughout the centuries, and giving us sort of this prelude to 18th and 19th century colonialism, which was dismantled in many parts of the world in the mid to late 20th century. But the afterlives of colonialism are still ongoing. We're still dealing with them. And in terms of environmental devastation, we can pinpoint colonialism as the start of the level of degradation that we have today. So in a lot of ways, Orientalism helps explain to us how we got here. Let me further define it by giving you two other forms or manifestations of Orientalism. First, we have latent Orientalism, which is a set of subconscious ideas or prejudices about the so-called Orient. And remember, the Orient, perhaps in the European imaginary, because of where Europe is situated, was mostly referring to the southern and eastern Mediterranean. This included for many centuries Spain, Italy, and Greece, because they were browner Europeans, the Levant and North Africa. But perhaps in the US imaginary, when we think Oriental, we think East Asia. So China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. And if you look at policies from these areas or from these countries, you can see that the wars or sort of the colonial enterprises that took place really were concentrated in their respective vision of the Orient. But latent Orientalism kind of refers to this belief that's a myth that the Orient is static, barbaric, in need of revival and restoration, and that the people living there happen to be this inconvenience to the actualization and restoration of the glories of great antiquity. So when we think about this, we want to think about, in the imaginary, this is ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and all of the major cities across the Mediterranean that were major centers for these empires. The people there, the modern iterations of the culture, were seen as an inconvenience that needed to be dealt with, savages and barbarians that needed to be civilized. And when we think about latent Orientalism, what I want you to think about is cliches. So we want to think about things like magic carpets, camels, sand, Aladdin. Those are examples of latent Orientalist stereotypes. On the contrasting from that, conversely, we have manifest Orientalism, which describes the way in which Western societies interacted with the Orient. This is often referred to as an encounter or a mission. So it could be, a cultural encounter between East and West, or it could be a civilizing mission, the white man's burden, to save these people from their innate barbarism, if that is possible. And this was achieved through colonialism, war, commerce, policy, and empire. So those are the two ways in which we interact with latent and manifest, in which we interact with Orientalism generally. So we want to think about latent Orientalism as a thing that we see today that survives in films. So the terrorist is always Middle Eastern, Russian, Black, or Latin from the Latinx community. Manifest Orientalism is more so in terms of vaccine apartheid, policies, wars, invasions of land. So one is more the cultural kind of way that this fossilizes, and then one is the more active way that we act upon it. So then the question becomes, how did Orientalism fossilize? How did it become this thing that is so present in the European imaginary? And remember here, we're referring to also European outposts, such as the United States, Canada, white South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So it's not just the continent of Europe. This is really beyond just a continental understanding. This is much vaster than that. But for the sake of kind of compartmentalizing the sources of power and how those influenced the way in which we live in this world and the systems that we've inherited, we have to understand that the center that was presented to us culturally was always a European entity or a European outpost. So the first way that this was fossilized was through the process of othering, which a lot of times when we talk about Orientalism, it goes hand in hand with othering. The Orientals were referred to in European cultural production as the other, okay? Which means that they are not in the center, they are peripheral or marginalized figures. They were deliberately placed in the periphery, they were deliberately marginalized, even on their own lands. But especially in the ways that this has come to sort of exist in the historical and cultural archive, Europe fashioned a false sense of cultural supremacy by having an other through which to position itself. So if I want to place myself on top, I have to have somebody else I'm projecting this image of superiority onto, which is the other, which is an inferior. The second way that it fossilizes is truly through cultural output and material production. So this can come in the form of paintings, books, goods, commodities, who has access to those goods and commodities. That became prominent in Europe and its outposts, again, not just the continent, but everywhere else that has this Eurocentric vision over the course of several centuries. So even if we're talking about colonialism of the 19th century, we have to understand that colonialism of the 19th century was developed and fashioned from cultural ideologies that existed for centuries before that, okay? And in this regard, Orientalist art and advertisement become particularly important for people to see and imagine what is really a fantasy of the so-called Orient, that it wasn't really anything that we see, like we see in this painting or the one that was before it on the slide before. This is the phantasm, okay? The fantasy of the Orient that was basically given to people to digest, to consume, to believe in, and it had no there was very little veracity, very little truthfulness to the actual way that people lived, and the societies that the people of the so-called Orient fashioned their own civilizations, had their own relationships to land, had their own way of creating products, you know. So there's so many aspects to this that leads to how this image of an inferior other in the form of the Oriental fossilizes in culture and people's minds, and also influences directly policy and systems that are designed to maintain that myth of cultural supremacy. So I just wanted to give you quickly a few representations of the other that appear in hundreds of thousands of examples of paintings, of books, of stories throughout the century. And this picked up the pace in terms of cultural material output in the 19th century, in the 1800s. The first, and these are very gendered, by the way, tropes. So the first is the sexualized other. Women were often represented as very sexualized, hypersexualized beings. They were often portrayed in paintings naked or semi-naked, surrounded by, as you can see, luxurious fabrics and feathers and gold and things like that. And there was always the positionality of the viewer of these paintings as someone who is interrupting a forbidden moment, and the women in their spaces, whether it was the harem or the hammam, the bathhouse, or the room where women congregate in the company of one another, away from the male gaze, they were waiting for somebody to come and have an experience with them. So this became an obsession and a form of cultural trespass that was hypersexualized and by extension dehumanized women in this region, objectifying them. The second trope is in the middle, which is the idle other. So while women were hypersexualized, men were often represented in these paintings as idle, not as active agents. They weren't producing thought, they weren't producing culture, they weren't active in any sense. And they were just drinking tea, sitting around, napping, smoking. And oftentimes, if there was, for example, a representation of a Western figure in these paintings, that would be the engineer, the botanist, the naturalist, the artist, the writer, actively producing knowledge. And therefore, the myth there was they deserve to reap the benefits environmentally and in terms of resource extraction of these wonderful places, because the natives are just sitting around. They're not doing anything. And they're on par with animals, which leads us to the third trope, the trope of the noble savage. When we think of the noble savage, we want to think about, this is how Orientalism actually expands much beyond East and West dynamics. This is actually how we can relate it to what happened here in the Americas. The noble savage, you want to think Tarzan, you want to think Avatar, these creatures or these beings that were half human, half animal. They were often portrayed, this is a 16th century trope, by the way, but they were often portrayed as, on the one hand, extremely innocent because they were not yet corrupted by the lustfulness of industrialized society and sedentary society and cities. But on the other hand, they were, because they didn't have that exposure, they were often portrayed as bestial, on par with the animal world. And so then it was like, the innocence is the noble aspect, but then their connection or adjacent kind of positionality to the animal world is what made them savage. So when we think about Columbus invading the Americas and encountering the native tribes of these lands, the trope of the noble savage is key to understanding that particular encounter. But in other places where there are more, there are both nomadic societies and sedentary societies. That means people who are tribal and move around and are nomadic, and also equally within that society, people who live in cities and are urbanized. There was still no recognition of what they've achieved on their own merit. There was still this idea of disposing of any kinds of meritocracy in those places, and instead being obsessed with reviving the glory of the ancient past, which was the Crusader past, and by extension, going further back in history, also the glory of the Roman and Greek empires. Okay, and I want to conclude this section on defining Orientalism with this quote by Edward Said, where he says, to simply say that Orientalism was a rationalization of colonial rule is to ignore the extent to which colonial rule was justified in advance by Orientalism rather than after the fact. In order to separate people from the right to freedom, from the right to their land, in order to sort of disengage with any sort of relationship that they have to land and environment and ecosystem, which Native peoples have an innate connection to because they fashion their culture as a response to the natural world. You have to dehumanize them, and in several ways, whether it's sexual, whether it's idle, whether it's savage, or what have you, in order to disinherit them from that land and cause and create areas in which they exist on the periphery. And there's a new center that the invader or the colonizer creates so that they can then reap the benefits of whatever resources are on that land. That's what colonialism effectively did, was create an umbilical cord of power through economic capital from the colonies to London, to Paris, to Washington, to what have you. So this is an important thing to remember when we think about Orientalism as a process of othering and dehumanization, and then conversely also colonialism. Now, how this was achieved is by marrying the philosophy of othering with another myth, the myth of discovery. Okay, so this goes back before 19th century colonialism, but it's important. The doctrine of discovery was basically a prototype of a philosophy or a declaration that stated that unless a place was under the auspices of a Christian, European, white, what have you, this expands, right? We can zoom in, we can zoom out. It doesn't really matter. But unless it's a European sort of entity that is in charge of these lands, then it is up for grabs and undiscovered. So think about the ways this doctrine was published about 40 years before Columbus quote, discovered the Americas, but we know he invaded the Americas. So in it, Pope Nicholas says, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, which is a reference to the Muslims of the Iberian Peninsula and Spain and Portugal, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate, key words, appropriate, to himself and his successors, kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use of profit. Okay, this is basically the prelude to capitalism and the prelude to colonialism. And the idea that if a place was not, again, under a European rule, we'd hear Christian in the case of the papacy, then it was up for grabs and undiscovered, which bleeds into another myth that we have, Terra Nullius, the myth of no man's land, with the colonization of Australia roughly 300 years later, where the British Navy establishes a penal colony in Australia, sending their prisoners to this land. And it was considered an empty land because the native populations, aboriginals of Australia, were not considered human enough to count in population. Okay. On the right here, we see the map that shows us all of the nomadic tribes of Australia, and their dominions, and this was completely ignored because the British considered Australia terra nullius, and therefore only the things that were established and erected in the name of the British Royal Navy were considered legitimate. But on the other hand, Australia, for those of you who know about it, is environmentally speaking, not the easiest place to live. So the indigenous knowledge of how to deal with the flora and fauna and the animals that existed there was appropriated by the British Empire in order to teach the settlers how to live in such a difficult terrain. But we can see the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, which has been reiterated countless times throughout history as key core myths of colonial enterprises or colonial missions. And there's so many other places and contexts throughout the world where this example of, a no man's land, a land with no people for a people of no land exists in history. So comparably here in the Americas, the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the expansion of the US throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable, also stems from, again, this kind of cancerous, constantly evolving ideology, claim to property rights, claim to land, claim to resources, claim to power, that just continues to evolve no matter where we place it. We can place it in Australia, we can place it in Ireland, we can place it in South Africa, we can place it in Palestine, Hawaii. These are all very similar ideological philosophies that say the settler has the God-given right to expand the terrain as far north, as far south, as far west, as far east as they can, and that this is an inevitable reality. But the key there is also that if you have access to land, you have access to resources, which then gives you power because your economy is strong. So this is all really important. With regards to 19th century colonialism, in cultural studies, we often refer to the Napoleonic Campaign in Egypt as the watershed moment between East and West. This was a moment in history that also kind of set the tone for how Orientalism continues to exist in our world today. But Napoleon and a fleet of French soldiers, botanists, geographers, cartographers, and so many other scientists and learned men, in quotations, they were learned men, but they were also invaders and colonizers, arrive in Alexandria, Egypt in 1798 with the intention of knowing the land, every inch of Egyptian soil. And one of the main things, there are two main things to keep in mind here. The first is that this 3-year military campaign was the result of it was a serial publication called La Description de l'Égypte, the description of Egypt, which was a multi-volume encyclopedia that gave people insight, direct insight into every plant, every geological element, every architectural structure, every cultural element, all the cities, all the rivers of Egypt. And it was published serially, making its full appearance in the early 1800s. But it became the blueprint for how to colonize. And in fact, the French army attempted to go through Egypt up into Syria, Palestine, and they were defeated by a coalition of Palestinians in Nakka. So they were not able to expand into Syria. Their intention was to go through Syria along the Silk Road, eventually leading them to India, and so they can counter the British Empire and gain control of all of the resources that the British Empire developed and extracted from India, but also all of the places along the way that they managed to find. So this is also important because if the French had succeeded in Egypt, Egypt would have become what Algeria later became nearly 29, 30 years later, when Algeria was colonized by the French for 132 years until their independence in 1962. So Egypt was the first experiment and it failed, and Algeria was actually the second experiment and it failed. So in terms of culture, what you can see also is how Egypt is depicted as an empty land. The only figures that you see coming into contact with the monuments of Egypt, which is a great city of antiquity again, are the French savants and the philosophers. And if you look in the background behind the Sphinx, you can see that there are a few fleets of troops. They're probably collecting information on the Egyptian terrain. This leads us to the fashioning of the grand tours, which began in the 17th century, starting mostly in England. In their initial iterations, they began in England, and the sons of aristocrats would do this coming of age passage through France and Germany with the intention of going to Italy to then go and draw the monuments of ancient Rome, but it was considered a coming of age. So every aristocrat was accompanied by their tutor and went on this rite of passage. In the Victorian era, this expands to the entire Mediterranean basin. So Rome, so Italy, Greece, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Tunis, Morocco, all of these places become fair game and part of the Grand Tour. And the Victorian version of it was monopolized, these voyages, by a tourism company called Thomas Cook and Sons. And again, if we want to think about how institutions are formed, this is a institutional kind of thing that happened for most people. So if those of you who have watched Bridgerton recently, when Colin goes on his grand tour of Greece, this is part of the fashioning of men of empire. And this is also important because these same people often would go to Cambridge, Oxford, the Sorbonne, all of these very old and prestigious European universities, and they would study the classics. So they would study philosophy, Greek, Latin, and Italian. And then that was their political education. Those same people became officers of the empire and would go out and regulate control of the colonies. So this is how institutions are developed, by ideologically influencing the way that people think about the places they come into contact with and the people they come into contact with, the natives. But also, if they go into government, they're the people creating policies and designing the way the world works. And in many ways, we are still dealing with the aftermath and the afterlives of this particular systemic design of a global North now versus global South division. But these are not sort of the happenstances of like the evils of, industrialization and technology. It was a deliberate cultural development that was created. So then we have to ask ourselves, how does Indigenous knowledge play a role in this? And this is really important, okay? Because Indigenous knowledge throughout any of these, quote, missions or encounters was deliberately appropriated. It was crucial, on the one hand, to have a local guide who knows the terrain, who knows the environment, who knows where to drink from, who knows what to eat, who knows how seasonally things operate, to guide these people. But so they, on the one hand, the natives and the locals are essential to the success of a colonial mission. And those same natives have an innate connection to the land. They live in service to land. They see themselves as part and parcel of an ecosystem. They've developed cultures that respond to those ecosystems or the biomes that they live in. So if it's the desert, Bedouins live a very specific type of way, right? In order to survive within that biome. But the settler and invader, conversely, doesn't have that same relationship to the land because they don't have also the cultural understanding of how to respond to the land. And their main interest is actually maintaining not only cultural supremacy, but disregarding any sense of ecological balance and preservation of nature, in exchanging that for instead economic and capital control and power. So the idea is domination, but the only way to achieve that domination is by othering people and marginalizing them and dispossessing them and disinheriting them from their land. And also, when we appropriate Indigenous knowledge to learn how to navigate the pyramids of Giza, or to learn how to navigate the Sahara or the Amazon or what have you, or Australian terrain, we can then say, I discovered this. These local savages don't even know how to take care of themselves. They're savage. They need to be civilized. They need to be saved. So it's also a maintenance of that myth of cultural supremacy, disguising invasion and colonization as a burden of the civilized world. So this is part of, again, the way that culture it helps to describe how the culture of colonialism gave us the system and the world that we have today. We see it today with vaccine apartheid. We see it today with how the news chooses to pay attention to certain humanitarian crises versus the other. These are remnants or relics of these types of encounters or confrontations. All right, so colonial control into capitalism. This is an important question. I'm going to give you an example case study of an oasis in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which was a crucial desert oasis that was destroyed in the early 20th century. And in its place, the Saudi Aramco oil refinery site was established. So again, if we look at the early archives of petroleum engineers, the same people who gave us a oil-driven capitalist system, we're all reliant on oil, unfortunately, in the current system that we have. Everything we buy is wrapped in plastic. Our lunch, our vegetables are wrapped in plastic. This is, again, a petro-modernity that is by design. But one of the things that also destroyed was a way of life in these areas. So in the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin and nomadic tribes are much like the nomadic tribes of the rest of the world. They live seasonally. They have a connection to their environment. It's very intrinsic. It's ancient. It's millennia old. And in the early archive of how these oil refinery and discovery kind of missions happened, the way in which the Bedouin encounter, again, or come face to face with the oil engineers sounds a lot like the way that natives of this continent felt when they encountered Columbus. They were completely baffled by some of the things that were happening. And one of the things that they lost is not only their way of life, but the destruction of very important ecological reserves, such as the oasis, which is this little piece of heaven in the middle of the desert that is essential to life in the desert. Without it, you can't live in the desert. So palm trees, dates, all kinds of fruits that come from palm trees, fresh water. And many of these, the natural ones have been destroyed in order to create oil refinery sites, because what lies underneath the ground is much more interesting in terms of capitalism than, say, what lies on top of it. Indigenous loss as environmental catastrophe is important here. There's a writer named Abdulrahman Munif, who I actually work on. He wrote this 500-page novel about this oil encounter, and he narratizes in literature the experience of Bedouins who lost their way of life because they came into contact with consortium of European and American oil engineers coming from who had stopped drilling in California and then went to the Arabian Peninsula to start discovering oil and creating oil refinery sites there. And then in the place of this ancient way and sustainable way of living, they design a system of cities made of salt. And he defines this as cities of salt means that cities that offer no sustainable existence. When the waters come in, the first waves will dissolve the salt and reduce these great glass cities to dust. In antiquity, as you know, many cities simply disappeared. It is possible to foresee the downfall of cities that are inhuman. With no means of livelihood, they won't survive. So in this way, he was half Bedouin, a Bedouin from the Arabian Peninsula, half Iraqi. And he's saying, on the one hand, guess what? My indigenous knowledge, I'm putting it in this epic novel, which is considered one of the best Arabic novels of the 20th century. I'm speaking on behalf of the underrepresented, the Bedouin nomads of this area. And I'm deconstructing the myth of civilization, that glass cities and unsustainable cities are better for us than the way that we were living before, because these don't think about life after oil. So this is just one example, but there are many other examples. The natural world is a teacher. For many communities around the world, you cannot live or exist outside of seasonal limits. So there are areas in this world where you can't have watermelon in winter. You can't have oranges in the summer. You have to live seasonally. This is just how it is. But we're living in a settler colonial reality, which has given us the false impression that if we have access to everything all the time, it's actually better for us, but it's not better for us. It's bad for us, and it's bad for the environment as well. But it's important to understand that in many places, agriculture and culture are the same. They're linked, hence why agriculture has the word culture in it. But it is important to learn from these communities, because they have basically passed down that knowledge from generation to generation. I want to give you the example of Native Americans, for example, used congealed petroleum for medicinal purposes for centuries, long before Vaseline became a commodity that we buy at the pharmacy. This is indigenous knowledge that was appropriated by colonialist capitalist endeavors. And this leads us to commodity as consumption, okay? So Robert Chesbrough is the chemist that is often credited for creating Vaseline. He happened upon it because he saw some petroleum and railway workers in Pennsylvania and Ohio applying congealed petroleum on their wounds. They had learned this from the indigenous communities, and it was expediting the healing process. So he refines it and creates patents the name Vaseline and creates this product that people can buy. But as you can tell, there's no reference to the indigenous communities that actually discovered this medicinal property of congealed petroleum, or the medicinal benefits of oil long before we had Vaseline, and also no mention of how the ingredients are sourced or where they come from. So this is just an example of one appropriation of indigenous knowledge and the discrediting of those indigenous communities because of Orientalist and colonialist practices for the benefit of capitalist interest. We also have the soap industry, which has a very racist and discriminatory past. So I have two advertisements from soaps, and I'm sorry, this might be very upsetting to a lot of people, but the advertisements, especially in the soap industry, if you just Google Orientalist soap advertisement, the things that you will find are beyond imagination. Those advertisements are normally reductive or racist in their depiction of natives and or quote unquote others. So in the first one, we have a French colonial advertisement of Oriental soap, okay, super fine soap with the smells of the Orient. So if you use this product, it will transport you to the fantasy of the Orient. So if we go back all the way to the first couple of slides, where I show you the sexualized and seductive fantasy Orient, the Aladdin of Orients, this is what this product is promising us, right? And then in the second iteration, we also have the Orientalist trope of, the white man's burden to civilize anyone with melanin in their skin. So fairy soap, which you can still buy today as a dish soap and many people still use, has this advertisement where a white child is telling an enslaved African child, why doesn't your mama wash you with fairy soap? And a lot of the fairy soap advertisements actually have this Orientalist kind of imagery where they place the baby in a bathtub and half the body comes out white and the other half remains dark. So the soap industry is one example of a colonialist-oriented capitalist commodity where the ingredients and how to make it were sourced from Asia, so olive oil soap, etc., rice soap from Japan, but there's no reference at all of where that knowledge comes from. And then conversely, also the way that it's sold to us to consume, given to us to consume, is wrapped in this really problematic language and this reductive and dismissive language. On the one hand, only Europeans have access to luxury or deserve it. And on the other hand, there's also this like double-sided aspect of it of, well, if you use this product, you'll get transported to the Orient, and what a great fantasy experience that will be, right? And then this one is probably the most disturbing, but certainly not the last example. You can look at so many different commodities, but for many centuries in Europe, there was an obsession with consuming corpses or corpse powder for what was believed to be medicinal reasons. So for example, if somebody had epilepsy, they were told that if they ate elixirs or powders from crushed mummies, that would be a cure for epilepsy. But on the other hand, it was also, these tombs in Egypt were pillaged, and the majority of mummies in Egypt have kind of been consumed over the centuries. People don't know this history, it's very dark. But for example, the pigment that I have on the right of the screen at the bottom is an example of a paint that sold out every time it was produced because the brown, mummy brown for painters, was one of the most luxurious things that you could buy, but also it contained the pigment, the brownness of the pigment came from crushed mummies. So this obsession with consuming the Orient or forget the Orient, just any kind of resource from a land that was colonized or forever altered by colonialism or capitalism became an obsession. So if we think about cash crops like cotton or sugarcane or tea or spices or rice, all of these are examples of, well, I really want access to this now. how is this being produced and brought to me? Who's being enslaved for the free labor to produce it? Who are the communities that are being divorced and separated from their land in order to give me access to it? Those questions were never asked. It was seen as a God-given right to have access to these luxurious commodities. And there are so many more. I mean, there's sugarcane from the Caribbean. There's citrus from mandatory Palestine, the Jaffa orange. There's tea from India. There's gemstones from Africa. There's so many examples of commodities that fuel our obsession with consumption, and also the divorcing us from the processes that allow us to have access to these commodities as well. So, and this kind of bleeds into today. When we use something and we throw it away, very few of us actually think about the afterlife of that. The last thing I wanted to end on is a hopeful note. So, you know, what hope do we have? So the IPCC in its latest report determined, which came out in spring, summer of 2022, declared that yes, colonialism caused climate change. We know that Orientalism mandated colonialism, that colonialism gave us a capitalist system, so we can see how these things happen. But there is hope because we have the ability to return to indigenous cultural practices and knowledge, and remember that agriculture and culture are linked. We need to dismantle colonialist structures that enable and continue the cultivation of cash crop and monoculture, agriculturally speaking, which are bad for people and environment. We need to support, these are just some examples, communities with invaluable intangible cultural heritage, which is defined by the United Nations as non-material knowledge, knowledge that can only be passed down from generation to generation, from person to person. All of these things are really helpful, but we have access to centuries long knowledge from communities that is still relevant today. Obviously holding corporations and institutions accountable, and that remember that if an Orientalist and colonial system is by design, it was created by design, it can be dismantled, and a new system can be put in its place. So there's several ways in which we can think about the origins of the system we currently have and the potential replacements that we can go forward. And I think the other, my colleagues in the series are better suited to speak of those, but really what Orientalism gives us is the origin story of how we got here, how people are dehumanized and then dispossessed, disinherited, how Orientalism leads to colonialism that leads to capitalism through neocolonialism, through neoliberalism and overconsumption. And hopefully that was a helpful primer for us to make those connections.
Thank you so much.
Questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Suja, for the time that you've taken to put this together and how you walked us through, you know, the origin stories and what we can learn from Orientalism and environmentalism. In the chat, there was so much knowledge and, you know, connecting the dots between the idea of no man's land, for example, and you know, conservationists and folks that are seizing land from indigenous people under the premises of planting more trees. We see that also in Palestine. Just understanding the origin story allows us to demystify this big idea of what do we mean when we are talking about systemic change and decolonization, when we are also looking at designing new systems. You know, the relationship you created between agriculture and culture was key. We also look at it as, you know, as Colin said in the beginning, systemic change is primarily grounded in cultural change and cultural change. And so that's why the series is so important for us. And thank you so much for kicking off.
Thank you for having me.
The pleasure, Anjad, is ours. In the Q&A, there's some questions. So what I could do is allow you to go through them, but I can also read them out loud. And, you know, and also if you want to scroll through the chat, see what you missed. There was a lot of important knowledge. We also took screenshots and we're recording that. We would also love to invite everyone to join us on Slack. You know, there's a lot of research and resources that we share on Slack, and a similar experience to what you've seen in the chat here. It happens also on Slack. So definitely join us.
Oh, sorry.
So Adela Cardona asked, how can we learn more about systems and complex systems? Is there any systems thinking course you recommend?
Everything Slow Factory does is a great way to start. You know, I think people often say in order to know where you're going, you have to know the history of where you've been. And I really think that demystifying sort of the deliberate kind of confusion around how systems or how institutions create a culture around them is the first step. And I think I want to go back to what Colin said in the beginning. This is really a multifaceted beast. We need people to be creative and attack it on all sides. Personally, my contribution is through the cultural lens because that's what my expertise is. But I find a lot of hope in people creating new institutions also, and new ways of approaching major, you know, for example, waste-led design, major challenges that we have through combating bad design with products manufacturing. I don't personally have the knowledge to do any of that, but I think that speaks to the larger issue that we have, that everybody needs to kind of rally their collective expertise to look at this as multifaceted as possible, and then add to the way that we're dismantling it together. It's collective. It's really collective.
And I would also add that there isn't just a class that's like, this is the system, this is how we dismantle it. Because again, it's, as Colin said in the beginning, it's compounding effects and it is interconnected with other topics. So we can make parallels between the system, the ecosystem, or the systems that are designed currently, and how they could be understood in looking at, for example, an operating system within a computer and how we are able to code the machine. And I think Colin comes from that school of thought as an engineer themselves. I don't know, Colin, if you want to jump in before I move to the next question.
Sure. I mean, there's a few things that went by in that I would love to touch on. One is starting with history and knowing where we're coming from in order to know where we are and where we're going. And if I think of it this way, one thought is that the beginning of this class is now history. And that history is basically everything that gets us up to now. So any kind of thought that there was a thing in the past and it doesn't, that there's a break between history and now we're somewhere different. I think, just to reiterate what you're saying, Suja, like, no, it's the same continuum, and we are only talking about anything that we can talk about our experience in relation to the history that is now building onto it. So just thinking of that history, it's not something, no matter how long ago it was, it's not separate from right now.
Exactly.
And it builds into now, and it's fascinating, some of the, these really disturbing examples of the types of thinking that is clearly continuing to inform our cultures, the intersection of our cultures, the exploitation, and everything that we're talking about. The other thing that I want to think about, kind of on a continuation of that, like history is continuing from forever ago into now, and same thing is the practice of analyzing, of thinking, of recontextualizing, and then of fighting, of that's a practice. It's not a one-time thing, and even learning and understanding it must be continuing. I mean, every single open edu, and this is no exception at all, I learn a bunch of specific things, and a bunch of like more information that puts into context things that I'm already very well familiar with, or whatever. I love it. And yeah, I will just encourage everybody. It's all about the process. It's all about us as a part of this flow of history. We all exist within it. Everything that we can look at and criticize, we also are part of in some kind of way. And so just being really clear about that, continuing to dig into the difficult parts of that, and seeing any kind of way that we can push on the boundaries of where we want to go. That's the starting place, I think.
If I could just add a couple of things. Well, I would just say, I think identifying where some of these injustices are is the crucial first step, right? So, for example, if I'm talking about Orientalism, I could not help but think about who had access to the vaccines and who didn't as a form of Orientalism. The news coverage on Ukraine versus that of Syria or what have you, Orientalism. Where our clothes go if we don't want them anymore, that we can dispose of them in the deserts of Chile or in on the African continent. That's Orientalism. That's somebody else's problem to deal with our, when I'm done with having the best of everything, it's not my problem anymore. But I would also say, in terms of solutions, which is really important for me to make sure that people feel that they're aware, but that they also have the capacity to act, is there's no right or wrong way to do it. So if you're an engineer, approach it from an engineering perspective. If you're a material scientist, create new materials. If you're an artist, create art that counters stereotypical. We still have very stereotypical images in, most shows. If there's a hijabi, a woman who wears hijab, without fail, every single time, there has to be an episode where she takes off her hijab, or she has to take off, or it falls off. That's Orientalist, right? Counterculture is really important. Let's create culture that is inclusive on purpose, not just to pay lip service to something. So I would just make people aware that there's no right or wrong way to contribute. You contribute in the way that you know how to do that best, and expand your knowledge throughout the process.
I love that. Thank you for that. Thank you for adding that. Next question is, how does decriminalizing parallel to abolition? And someone in the chat mentioned Dr. Maxley Boiron's series of classes, Discard Studies. Dr. Maxley Boiron also gave a class for OpenEDU a few semesters ago. And they said something that was extremely powerful, is that pollution is legal. It's not criminalized. And just as you answered the question, how does decriminalizing parallel to abolition, Dr. Suja, just think about what is allowed, what is legal, what is protected by the law, which is waste, which is pollution, which is the seizing of indigenous land to build holes, to create landfills, and what is criminalized, plant medicine, alternative medicines, access to education, even right now, as we are seeing. What do you think? How does it parallel to abolition?
It's a really good question, Celine, and I think you just kind of answered it for me. Culturally and systemically, I find myself frustrated with what's allowed to take place and what isn't. As you said, the fact that there's, very little accountability for people who go over their carbon emissions, or corporations who are responsible, that this is within a legal framework, that the most vulnerable populations are placed in prisons for things that the whole system doesn't make any sense. Seeing certain humans as disposable or innately barbaric or more prone to criminal activity versus those that are, the corporate headmongers of corporations, the ones that are really killing us, are going around flying on private jets. I mean, I really think that the entire way that we think about privilege and what is allowed and what isn't allowed, even something like national parks, if we really look back at the history of those, they're extremely violent. And in many cases around the world, they cover up mass graves of indigenous people. All of that is done within a legal framework. I think sometimes you just have to look beyond what is legal. And kind of, that's where I think Andreas Malm's recent books on how to blow up a pipeline and fossil capital are really informative, because I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be promoting destruction, but I'm just saying that there needs to be, we can't depend on what is legal and what is the law to look for solutions. We have to depend, I think, in my case, I say, depend on action to change the system. I mean, following the rules hasn't gotten us far.
100%.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, anonymous attendee asks, I'm wondering, suggestion for future classes. Would it be possible for the PowerPoint presentation format so that parts of the slides are consistently left free to allow for closed captioning to not block the content? Thank you for asking. While the closed captioning can be moved across the screen, it would be nice if we didn't have to move it often. I agree. Thank you for that suggestion. We'll keep it in mind. And of course, everything will be recorded right now and edited. And the edit that we do allows for closed captioning and for ASL to be positioned in a way that does not cover the slides, but we will keep it in mind for the live classes. Thank you. Anonymous attendee, in Manifest Orientalism, I think they meant Manifest Destiny. The examples of the interactions of missions include colonialism, war, policy, commerce, and empire. Wouldn't empire encompass all of the above? I get this question a lot, even when I post on social media. Folks argue that instead of using the word colonialism, we should be using the word imperialism. How does it differ, or what do we mean when we say that instead of the other?
That's a great question. So in the Manifest Destiny was a form of Manifest Orientalism in a sense. That's a really great question. I think that in the realm of cultural studies, we refer to colonialism because it speaks to the larger injustices of dispossession, disinheritance, whereas former imperial powers, former colonial powers, they will never say, for example, in England, let's go study colonial history. They'll say, we're going to study imperial history, because they're at the center of that narrative. And if you use the word imperial or imperialist, in many cases in the world, that does not have the same negative connotation as using colonial. Even if they're this, two sides of the same coin, one has a positive connotation of great power, of historical greatness, of historical economic strength, and the other one is actually holding people accountable for a very destructive structure. And and then in terms of, I know in the US we prefer to say US imperialism, for example, but I don't think that works necessarily in the British or French context, for instance. But we can say, for example, George Bush and the war on terror was an example of Manifest Orientalism that fed into US imperialist motives, because the US is a settler colony and it has not contended with its colonial reality, really. We erase it. So we prefer to say our imperial missions or imperialism. But in that sense, if the US started off as an extension of Britain, I guess I see the difference, but in terms of what we've done since our independence, it's comparable. So it's semantics, but just know that colonialism tends to hold those accountable for their actions, versus imperialism can sometimes have a positive connotation culturally.
And even culturally, we still discuss about building an empire, or the empire state of mind, or this idea of having an empire. We even could, describe, a lot of, celebrities as having built an empire, or just the idea of an empire as a very positive achievement. So that's why I agree with you. That's why I use that word, but also it was very hard to explain that often in a comment on Instagram. So thank you for
Celine, I see a question I'd like to answer, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course, please do. Yes.
Emma asks, would you be able to speak about the role Orientalism plays in some of the responses to natural disaster, which are so often neo-colonial in nature, and overlook the role of colonialism and capitalism in creating these disasters? So obviously it's not lost on me the timeliness of this question, given the state of affairs in Syria and Turkey, but obviously not exclusively Syria and Turkey. I will just share an anecdote. This past summer, I was in Barcelona for a course on the continued effects of colonialism on EU policy in the Mediterranean, and I had an Italian colleague who expressed guilt for living in a place with such privilege, and she's like, she was speaking of it. I mean, she was younger, so I want to give her a pass, but she was speaking of it as if it was like God decided, that Europe was going to be better, and that we have to share that privilege with other people who aren't as lucky. And I looked at her and I said, no, it's not a divine entity that created this, it's people, and it's not haphazard, it's by design. So again, going back to systemic design and change. And so the idea that there are places in the world that are just going to be more prone to natural disaster because of some abstract kind of bad luck that they're doomed to deal with is a myth. You know, a lot of the level to which natural disaster impacts these places is due to bad civil infrastructure, is due to corruption, is due to history of colonialism and never really coming out of it, is due to deliberate de-development, neoliberal. There's so many things. But we have to be careful about how we talk about it, because we know for sure now in Turkey, it's become evident, for instance, that a lot of the buildings that fell during the earthquake are due to bad building and shortcuts in civil infrastructure and corruption. There's the earthquake part is natural. The level of the devastation is that's not natural. That was somebody making a decision that they were going to take shortcuts in infrastructure. And likewise, the most climate vulnerable places in the world are those that were deliberately de-developed by some of the dynamics we've just discussed. So we can talk about, you know, Mother Earth and nature and natural disaster, but we have to be careful in how we frame that, and just make sure that we remember that a lot of these places that are most vulnerable are that way on because of all the things that have failed them.
And thank you for that. Absolutely. Oftentimes we see even celebrities who are appointed by either UNICEF or the UN make speeches that it's about luck, that they are lucky and we are unlucky and stuff like that. So it's very damaging to look at it from that angle, that we have just happened to be so unlucky to be in these places. Did you see another question you would like to answer? Or should I just go back to the beginning? Also, we may not have time to answer all of them. It's already 1:15 p.m. EST. Our interpreter, we're now at one interpreter because our other interpreter had to leave. So if we can just maybe answer two more questions and then wrap it up, we can give you the rest of the Q&As, Dr. Suja, and you can answer at your leisure, and we will put the questions and answer back into Slack. But yes, if you have seen anything in particular, I would love to read Suleiman's comment. They're saying yes to saying colonialism and destroying it. That's why I started saying people of the global majority. Global majority is a collective term that first and foremost speaks to and encourages those so-called to think of themselves as belonging to a majority on the planet. It refers to people who are Black, African, Asian, brown, dual heritage, indigenous to the global South, and or have been racialized as ethnic minorities. Globally, these groups currently represent approximately 80% of the world's population, making them the global majority now. And with current growth rates, notwithstanding COVID-19 pandemic, they are set to remain so for the foreseeable future. And it's a quote by Rosemary Campbell Steffens, MBE. So thank you for that, Suleiman. Thank you for quoting Rosemary Campbell in the definition of global majority. We also at Slow Factor use the word global majority because this is also a misconception that we keep calling ourselves minorities and minority ethnic and so on, because we aren't actually the minority. And Dr. Suja, did you see another question that you would like to look into?
Yeah, I think I want to express the limits of my own knowledge. So I'm just seeing ones that I know I could answer. So there's one about natural history museums. So Julie says, I would love to hear your opinion on the entire institution of Western natural history museums who built their collections by exploiting indigenous knowledge and ecological communities where specimens were taken from, and what Orientalist tropes may plan into why natural history museums continue to hold onto zoological, botanical specimens, and even ancestral remains, rather than repatriating them to scientists and community leaders in the places where they were taken from. That's a really great question, because actually the museum industry as a complex as a whole is guilty of this. So not just natural history museums. The pillaging of artifacts was a crucial element of colonial missions. So T.E. Lawrence, the Lawrence of Arabia, who is often depicted in history as this really great British white man who helped the Arabs liberate themselves. Again, another myth, was actually a double agent, obviously, for the British Empire, and he was responsible for seeing the illegal pillaging and looting of artifacts into many of the British museums, for instance. And I speak of England a lot because I did my doctorate there. Many of the basements of these museums have thousands upon thousands of artifacts that are not up for display, and they also won't be repatriated. But I think the example of the dodo bird is like the perfect example to answer this question, because the dodo bird is kind of one of the main symbols of extinct species that we have, and there's no full skeletal kind of remain. We have a beak here, a foot there. There are near complete skeletal structures of the dodo bird, but historically speaking, when the Dutch and Portuguese arrived on the island of Mauritius, where this bird lived, they often said that it was a flightless bird, it was a terrestrial bird, it wasn't really afraid of humans, and this made the invaders very curious. It didn't taste good, it couldn't be eaten, so they were confused by how this animal didn't have any fear when it saw human beings, and it didn't adapt and fly over the establishment, the structures of the penal colony. So it became extinct within a very short time of the invasion of the island of Mauritius. But also curiously, perhaps not so curiously, like I said, there's no full skeletal structure of the dodo bird anywhere, but there's an obsession on the part of natural history museums to collect pieces of this bird. And I think that is really indicative to how these types of institutions work. The way that we read about the dodo bird is the same way we read about Black and brown folks who were colonized. They're too stupid to evolve. This is happening because they couldn't evolve. They're too savage. This is for their own good. If they go extinct, who cares? You know, survival of the fittest, a very Darwinian approach to life. And then there's the other aspect to it, and I'll end on this, is the idea that if we repatriate, and by we, I'm speaking in the voice of museums, if artifacts are repatriated, well, they're going to go back to these quote unquote godforsaken places that are devastated by war and corruption. So isn't it better that a museum in Berlin houses an Iraqi artifact rather than a museum in Iraq? I'm not so sure. This obviously I disagree with, but that's the rationale that so many people who refuse to repatriate specimen, whether biological, zoological, or cultural, they often use this argument. But never is the question asked, how did those communities get to that point of failed states and corruption in the first place? Isn't it because of colonialism? So we dispossess and disinherit and we extract in the West, but then we're not going to ask about the consequences of those actions and then say, well, the West has the right to preserve these artifacts because if they go back, they're going to just be destroyed. But we know in the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, some of the first things that were taken were artifacts out of those places. So I don't think that, natural history museums are the exception. I think it's just part of the rule of museums and the dark side of museums and how things are acquired. But I hope that was helpful.
Super helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Suja. I feel like we are not going to be able to have the time to go through any more questions because it's 1:22 p.m. EST. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We will record the chat. We will record the Q&A. Join us on Slack, but we will also be recapping everything in a newsletter. Thank you so much, Dr. Suja. Again, thank you, Colin, for the introduction. And thank you so much, Diane, for being here and for allowing us to have access for our deaf community today. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Paloma, for taking the notes. Thank you, Nicole, for putting this together. And thank you, every single one of you who participated in this chat and made this class even more interesting. And thank you all, and see you next week for the class with Maya Fino. And that's it. Thank you all. Bye.